IVM.
Hello and welcome to a brand new episode of the Musafir Stories, India's very own travel podcast, where each week we share the journey of travelers in their own words and relive their experiences with you, our listeners. Hi guys, welcome to a brand new episode of the Musafir Stories. As always, a big thank you to all of you who took time and who wrote to us. Thank you so much. If you want to further help the show, please do leave us a review and a rating. We'd like to thank Abhijit, Tushar, Prashant, Nidhi, Ankita, Varsha and Chaitanya. Thank you so much guys for your feedback. As for today's episode, we have a celebrity in the house. Ace podcaster and host of Echoes of India, Anirudh Kanisetti. He takes us on a trip down to the historic city and the beautiful ruins of Hampi. Let's find out more.
So with that introduction, we'd love to welcome Anirudh Kanisetti, host of the runaway hit podcast Echoes of India and more recently Yuddha, the military podcast. Anirudh, thank you so much for being on the Musafir Stories and welcome.
Hey Anirudh, welcome to the Musafir Stories.
Thank you guys so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's our pleasure, Anirudh. You have been the star of history. Like, trust me, from every time we listen to the Echoes of India, we're just so fascinated by that, how the entire episode and all seasons have gone. And when we were so glad that when we approached you for the Hampi episode and you agreed, it was like you made our day.
No, it's my pleasure really. I can't wait to talk about it with you guys.
Yeah.
Lovely. But Anirudh, the introduction I gave about you was quite brief and concise. So why don't you speak a little bit about yourself? Obviously, you host those two podcasts, but there's a bunch of other things you do as well. So please enlighten our listeners a little bit about you.
Thank you, Saif. So I'm a researcher and writer. I work at a place called the Takshashila Institution, which is a public policy think tank. Most of my work revolves around issues of geostrategy and technology policy, but that's mostly to fuel my real passion, which is history. So I moonlight as an amateur historian, hoping to get a higher degree in history sooner rather than later. And I'm currently working on a book on the medieval Deccan, namely the period before the arrival of the Sultanates, the period just before the formation of Vijayanagara, roughly 600 AD to 1100 AD. Now, this is a time which is among the most fascinating in global history. Is the period that sees, for example, the rise of Islam in West Asia, is the period that sees enormous developments in Europe, the really high chivalric medieval period where you think of Europe, right? I mean, knights and castles and all that. And it's also one of the great periods of history for China. This is when China really emerges onto the global stage as almost like a proto-industrial power, manufacturing iron, inventing gunpowder. But also interesting things happened in the Deccan at the exact same time. This was really the Deccan's time under the sun, the time when the Deccan Plateau more or less dominated the Indian subcontinent. It was the wealthiest, most militarily powerful of all of India's geopolitical regions. But it's also a period of history that's been almost totally forgotten, and a period that almost seamlessly kind of feeds into the history of Vijayanagara. And on that note, I think let's talk about Vijayanagara, guys.
Yeah.
Lovely. I think everyone's eagerly waiting for that book too, because just going by the experience of listening to Echoes of India, right? I'm sure everyone wants to get their hands on that book.
Absolutely, yeah.
Those two seasons, I would say personally, in Indian podcasting, it set a certain milestone, both in terms of being one of the first history podcasts being produced by an Indian, as well as in terms of the production quality of the whole podcast itself. So lovely. It's great to have you on the podcast, as we said again. And for just the convenience of the listeners, we'll also link to Anirudh's podcast in the show notes too, so you can check it out wherever you get your podcast at. Now, yes, jumping
That's very kind of you, sir.
Thank you, Anirudh. So, jumping on to the topic of the day, right? Hampi, no surprises. We kind of touched upon it a little bit, but
Yeah.
for no pun intended here, but for those of us living under a rock who do not know about Hampi, why don't you kind of just enlighten us a little bit about where Hampi is and why it's so popular?
So Hampi is in the it's on the basically on the border between Karnataka and Andhra Pradesh. It's one of the few medieval Indian cities that very substantially survives, almost untouched from its original form even today, and is definitely one of the only South Indian cities to have survived in that sense. Vijayanagara is most interesting because I think of many reasons, partially because of the beauty of the ruins themselves, these absolutely spectacular temples framed by this warm golden sandstone and these enormous boulders which like glow pinkish red in the sunlight. So it's a really beautiful place, a magical place, if you will, to wander around in, because you can very physically almost feel the presence of this vast history that all of us Indians are inheritors of. You can wander around these great avenues. You can look at these temples with like overgrowing with grass. You can look at the rushing waters of Tungabhadra river tearing these boulders apart, and you can almost hear the sound of what was at one point one of the largest cities on earth. It's almost like you can feel yourself transported back to that time. So there's a lot of reasons that I think make Hampi as popular as it is. But I think another reason why Hampi is remembered as vividly as it is because of the suddenness of its fall. I don't think anybody who lived in India in the 16th century could have imagined a point of time when the empire of Vijayanagara did not exist in the south. None of its teeming hundreds of thousands of inhabitants, none of the merchants from dozens of countries who were coming there. I don't even think its great rivals, the kingdom of Orissa or the Deccan Sultanates, ever expected the empire of Vijayanagara to collapse as suddenly and as dramatically as it did. And not only did it collapse so dramatically, but it was also completely abandoned within a generation, and its ruins were left basically to the jungle until they were rediscovered and then cleaned up and made suitable for tourism over the last couple of 100 years. So I think that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. And also that little bit of connection that I personally feel with Hampi being based out of Bangalore is that right around the time when I guess, I don't know, officially up until now it was 1537 or so when Bangalore was officially started by Kempegowda, right? And incidentally, I think Kempegowda was also one of the feudatory rulers of the Vijayanagara Empire, right? So
Yes,
I always feel that little connection. And it's kind of sad that right around that time when Bangalore kind of started off is when Hampi, late 1500s, is when it kind of the sunset upon Hampi in one way, right? So,
but at the same time, if not for the fall of Vijayanagara, you would not have seen the rise of Mysore. You would not have seen the rise of Bangalore itself. So, which is why, even though the fall of Vijayanagara is seen as a tragic event, and in many ways, of course, for its inhabitants, it must have been a tragic and extremely traumatic event. The fall of Vijayanagara is also tied into many of the great developments of India's history. The wealth of Vijayanagara, which was seized by the Deccan Sultanates, fueled a huge wave of Dakkani poetry, Dakkani literature, Dakkani architecture, keep in mind the other regions of southern India as well went in their own ways after the fall of Vijayanagara. The Nayaka kingdoms of South India, the Nayaka kingdoms especially of Tanjore, which later led to the flowering of Bharatanatyam and Carnatic music. So many other things really stemmed from the fall of Vijayanagara. So in a sense, even though there is a tendency to look at Vijayanagara as the end of a certain moment in history, it's really not. It's also the birth of many new moments in history. I think the same really goes for all the great cataclysms of history, right? Every ending is really just a new beginning.
Yep.
Wow.
Absolutely. And I think listeners have got a kind of flavor of what Anirudh and his podcast is all about, right? Just the way, the passionate way in which you talk about history. And
you just take us to a different world altogether.
And true to your point that it is a cycle. It is a cycle of life, a cycle in which I guess all the big kingdoms, like one falls and another rises. But some great context setting before we kind of start getting a little deeper into the history. Now, just in terms of, I know you briefly mentioned about the fall of Hampi as well, right? But can you also draw out a little before the Vijayanagara Empire? Because even that is kind of pretty significant, right? In terms of who ruled.
How Hampi started off also.
Started off as well. And it's basically, it has connections to the Ramayana as well, right? So that way also it's pretty important, pretty significant.
All right. So do you guys want the long version or the short version?
Maybe the shorter version, given that we still have to dive into Hampi.
Okay. So in terms of what came before Vijayanagara or even before the Sultanates, really, I think it's important to talk about the great empire of the Kalyana Chalukyas. Now, it's an empire that to many Indians really doesn't really ring much of a bell. Not a lot of people have really heard of the Chalukyas. But this was an empire that dominated most of the Deccan, most of Maharashtra, most of Karnataka, and collapsed catastrophically roughly in the 12th, 13th centuries and led to the rise of many small kingdoms that were all very vibrant and innovative in their own ways, but were also constantly at war with each other. Now, what happened in the 13th century was that this absolute wild card was introduced into the politics of the Deccan, and that was the raids of Malik Kafur, who is this Gujarati eunuch who was serving as a general for Alauddin Khilji, the Sultan of Delhi. Now, all of these Deccan kingdoms, as you can imagine, thought that they could use Malik Kafur for their own ends. And of course, Malik Kafur was a man who knew very well how to play the game of Indian politics. He knew very well how to achieve his own objectives. And he really led one of the most catastrophically successful military expeditions in Indian history. Now, very often when we think of Indian military geniuses, we think of Rajaraja Chola, or we think of any number of other Rajput kings or really Hindu kings, right? But if you look at what Malik Kafur achieved, destructive as it may be, the sheer amount of tactical and strategic and political and diplomatic capacity that this man shows, I think should really qualify him to also be considered one of the unsung military geniuses of Indian history, as controversial as that may be. So what Kafur does is that because of the fact that he comes and basically forces all these kingdoms of the Deccan to at least nominally pay tribute to Delhi, he also connects them to the much more efficient kind of military environment of northern India and Central Asia. So all of a sudden, over the course of a couple of centuries, you see these massive influxes of Central Asian warlords and of course North Indian warlords who are riding on horses, riding on cavalry, who totally managed to outclass the elephant and infantry based armies of southern India. And what this leads to is, in short order, the collapse of many of these kingdoms, the establishment of a new sultanate, the Bahmani Sultanate, based around Gulbarga in the Deccan. And because of the collapse of many of the southern kingdoms, so one example is of course the Hoysalas, whose temples at Belur and Halebeedu can still be seen not far from Bangalore. Because of the collapse of all these kingdoms, new innovative forces are kind of unleashed. And one of those new innovative forces is the family, the Sangamas, who would eventually form Vijayanagara. And in order to form Vijayanagara, they obviously wanted to choose a site that has a certain degree of religious and political significance. So they chose the site of Pampa Nagara. Now, Pampa Nagara was a sacred site to a goddess called Pampa. We don't really know too much about this goddess except for the fact that her devotees used to sacrifice flesh to her, and their own flesh, mind you. They would sacrifice their heads to her in return for various gifts. At some point, Pampa became associated with a certain form of Shiva called Virupaksha. The legend sprung up that, so Pampa was this local lass who was in love with Shiva and prayed to him, and he came down and married her. And as a result, this site is also sacred to Shiva. So it really becomes like a pilgrimage site. Right. So, and in India, I'm sure that you guys know, where there are pilgrims, there are also politicians. So slowly, that's how this holy site of Pampa gradually begins to emerge as a political site. And eventually, when the Sangama dynasty takes control of this whole area around the Tungabhadra river, they decide to set up their capital at this very site where all these legends have already started to accumulate. And that's really where the legend of Vijayanagara starts. Soon after that, you see these guys starting to come up with like interesting new myths that this site of Pampa was actually the mythical Kishkinda of the Ramayana. Right. Now think about why they would do this, right? Because if you manage to make your city seem like it's connected to this ancient mythology, you can also attract more pilgrims to it. You can attract more settlers to it. You can really sell people on the idea that it's a real living, breathing, mythical, legendary site. And that's really how the story of Vijayanagara starts.
Yeah, really interesting, and a lot of interconnected and interwoven pieces, right? That's what also makes it so much more interesting. I mean, obviously the place is beautiful to see. It has like great variety and diversity in types of the things that they are, but these stories are, I think, what make Hampi stand out even so much more, right, compared to some of the other kingdoms and the other great cities that we see in India. So thank you for calling that out, Anirudh. Now, just kind of getting a little more focused on the city and the ruins of the city, rather, right, even that stand today. If one is looking to kind of explore Hampi, how would you kind of lay out the city in itself, right? How is it organized? Because even back in the day, it was way ahead of its times, right? So would you like to call out how the city is structured as well?
So, I mean, way ahead of its times, I think, requires a little bit of contextualization. Because just keep in mind that nobody who lived in history ever thought of themselves as living in history, right? As far as they were concerned, they were the most modern, the most futuristic, most technologically sophisticated humans that had ever lived. Certainly compared to a lot of cities in Europe, Vijayanagara had like pretty extraordinary kind of amenities. Like even today, if you go to Hampi and like you cross the river and head a little off to the side of the Hippie Island, as it's called, you will see the remains of this gigantic aqueduct that has kind of collapsed, but originally kind of serviced the city with drinking water and all that. Right. So in a lot of ways, Vijayanagara really represents the culmination of many centuries of urban development in the Deccan. Interestingly enough, it's not even the only city in the Deccan at that time to be called the city of victory, which is what Vijayanagara means. That distinction also belongs to the Deccan Sultanate of Bijapur, or as it was called in Sanskrit, Vijayapuri, which also means city of victory. So there's really two cities of victory at the same time. Both of them are actually competing in a lot of ways, not just politically and militarily, but also architecturally. So in terms of how Hampi itself is organized, so if you recall what I said a little earlier about this kind of legend of Pampa and Virupaksha that had been formed. So since Virupaksha was the most important deity to the early rulers of Vijayanagara, they successively built enclosures around this very what used to be a very small shrine of Virupaksha into a truly gigantic temple. So even today, if you go and see that temple, you will see this towering gopuram, which is like a temple gateway, which just rises for like multiple stories. It's really almost as tall as a small skyscraper. And you really have to think about the kind of architectural ingenuity that went into making buildings of this height back in the 16th century. So not only are they using kind of stones that are carved to kind of fit perfectly into each other and like balance out the weights and stresses that are formed, they're also experimenting with new stuff like brick and plaster architecture, new forms of archways and all that, which are actually imported from the Islamicate sultanates. So Vijayanagara was really not averse to learning from its geopolitical rivals. It is really interested in being as modern as it possibly can. That means incorporating all the influences it possibly can, importing all the luxury goods it can, can from across the world. And that way, it really like reminds us of the way that even that modern Indians are even today. That same kind of cosmopolitanism, that same kind of interest in eclectic influences from across the world. Now, in terms of the way that Hampi today is kind of organized, there are really two big clusters that a visitor would actually see. The first is the Sacred Center, and the second is the Royal Center. There's also a very large archaeological area called the Urban Core, which was really where the densest part of the city once was, where all the mansions would have been found, where all the slums, all the markets were there at one point, but it's not really accessible to the general public. So in terms of the Royal Center and the Sacred Center, the Sacred Center, as you can imagine, is comprised of a large number of temples, including, for example, the Virupaksha temple that I just mentioned. But you can also see some pretty epic other stuff in the Sacred Center, including what at one point would have been Vijayanagara's great bazaars. And some of these avenues are like really the size of modern highways, right? I'm sure you guys have been there, you've seen it.
Yep.
And they're lined with two-storied marketplaces, like actually, and that still stand today. So just imagine, like the way that these stones were carved, these granite blocks were carved and balanced, were to create these massive two-storied bazaars, which would have had like different shops with kind of cloth partitions between them, all teeming with people, noisy, yelling, and like all varieties of South Indian languages, and perhaps even like a whole bunch of languages from the northern Deccan, perhaps even a little bit of Persian, perhaps even some Portuguese if you were lucky. And then, of course, you have the Royal Center. The Royal Center is really where the imperial family's buildings were. You can still see even today the foundations of the palace, the gigantic remains of the Mahanavami Dibba, where the Vijayanagara emperors would perform on ceremonial occasions such as Navratri, and of course some palaces as well, including the Lotus Mahal, and we also see the elephant stables. And in all of these places you will see not your typical kind of South Indian architecture at all. You always see new influences. You see the beautiful kind of archway that is very familiar to us from, say, Mughal architecture, that is very familiar to us from Islamic architecture generally, that Vijayanagara clearly had no problem in appropriating, because as far as they were concerned, it's a beautiful architectural element. Why would we not want to use it?
Yeah, because that kind of left me a little flabbergasted at the beginning when we saw. I was wondering if this was constructed at a later point by perhaps some of the people from the Sultanate who pillaged this. But yeah, clearly it wasn't, right? It was a part of the Vijayanagara kingdom's, how should I say, a policy, right? Like if it's beautiful, we'll take it, right? That kind of a thing.
Absolutely. You see that in the Lotus Mahal, you see that in the elephant stables, and you even see it inside some of their temple gateways, incidentally. You will see under this massive kind of typical South Indian pyramidal tiered superstructure, within the archway itself, you will see that it has an Islamic arch, which just goes to show you that there are a lot of things that both Vijayanagara and the Sultanates that were taking from each other that really had no religious connotation. And even though like a lot of people have gone out of their way today to try and portray Vijayanagara as a quote-unquote Hindu empire, and the Deccan Sultanates as essentially being ISIS in the 16th century, which is such a ridiculous way of looking at the way that like our ancestors actually did things.
And just kind of getting back to the beautiful bazaars also, right? The kind of things you find pretty close to the Sacred Center. This is right across the Virupaksha complex is what I believe the bazaars you're referring to, right? And these were, like you said, teeming with activity, and not just limited to like local trade, right? There have been kind of travelers right from Persia to Portugal and even Italy, I think, who have kind of come and much later on their accounts of their travels here, they have also kind of been used to reconstruct how it might have been back in the day, right?
Yeah, and honestly, like some of these accounts are so vivid. I believe one Portuguese traveler tells us that Vijayanagara, when he saw it at its peak, was even larger than Rome was, and according to estimates that I've read, it was easily one of the largest cities of its day. It was definitely larger than like almost any, I think, it was definitely larger than most European cities. The only city that we know for certain was larger and more populous was Beijing at that time. So that should give you a sense of the sheer scale of what we're talking about, right? And also keep in mind that medieval and really early modern cities are not necessarily as dense as modern Indian cities. They're a lot more spread out. There's a lot more gardens. There's a lot more fountains, a lot more waterworks, a lot more greenery. Just generally, houses are larger. There aren't as many constraints on like living space. So the entire scale of the city is just absolutely monumental. In fact, some surveys have shown that the entire kind of metropolitan area of Vijayanagara, which would have included like a large number of like small towns and villages and all that, actually stretches out to almost 650 square kilometers. And even today, if you climb onto one of the hills of Hampi, which I'm sure they will get to later in this conversation, you will see like stretching away, like as far as the eye can see, you will still see little bits of rubble. The remnants of like fortifications and walls and little towns and stuff that the elite would have built, temples, mansions, stuff like that, all of which would have been part of this kind of gradient of kind of human density, if you will, right? So the furthest away is not really very dense, but as you get closer and closer to the great city itself, things start to get like really crowded, really loud and noisy and colorful, and you would have started to see travelers from more and more parts of the world. As you said, Saif, you would have seen Portuguese, you would have seen Italians, you would have seen Persians, you would have seen people from like all over the Indian Ocean who would have come from the coast to actually come to Vijayanagara and sell things. You would have seen merchants of horses, you would have seen people who had come to buy Indian textiles, which for centuries, nearly the last millennium, India has really been famous for. You would have seen dealers in perfumes, in jewelry, in weaponry, perhaps even elephants, and of course you would have seen, I'm sure, street vendors selling you all kinds of food. So in a lot of ways it really would have been the kind of Indian city that you read about in literature, and also in a lot of ways the kind of Indian city that you still see around us today.
Yeah, absolutely. This is one of the like important pieces or important parts of the sacred center, right? The Virupaksha temple. But along with this, there's also...
Yeah, the Vittala temple as well, right, Anirudh?
Does that also fit into the sacred part of the, or sacred
The
center,
complex,
like we say?
So really the sacred center is the really dense complex of temples around the, I think it's the Hemakuta hill. I'm a little mixed up on the hills.
Yeah, that's the Hemakuta hill.
Hemakuta
You're right.
Yeah, the Hemakuta hill, right? So that's the hill that if you stand on, you will actually see the Virupaksha temple, but you will also see a number of much older temples which are really very neglected and have a very unique kind of architecture, because if you look at the kind of pyramidical structure on top of the temple, you'll see it's just made of these very like thin layers of stone, instead of these very thick kind of like sculpturally covered elements that you see in the Virupaksha temple. So these actually date from a much older period in the Deccan's history. It's a much more ancient architectural style and kind of shows you that the Hemakuta hill had been a sacred center for many kingdoms, for many religions, even not just the Shaivites but also the Vaishnavites and many cults that would have come squabbling to Vijayanagara, like kind of trying to get donations from all its people, going around preaching their message, just like modern Indian religions do. But the Vittala temple, since you guys asked, also has a interesting story of its own. The Vittala temple was built towards the apogee of Vijayanagara, just a few decades before its final collapse. And it was built by obviously the most famous of Vijayanagara emperors, Krishnadeva Raya. And Vittala is a form of Krishna, which is probably why Krishnadeva Raya chose to build a Vittala temple. But also, interestingly enough, Vittala is not really a South Indian version of Krishna. Vittala is a form of Krishna that originated in Maharashtra among pastoral communities, eventually became part of the mainstream. So it can be argued that the reason why Krishnadeva Raya built a temple specifically to Vittala was to kind of establish a kind of claim over the broader Maharashtra region, where of course his rivals, the Sultanates, were present.
Oh my God. I never knew that the Vittala temple had these many layers of history. I mean, I knew that it was dedicated to Krishna, but beyond that, like Krishna, that has its origin in Maharashtra and why Krishnadeva would choose to build it. It's magnificent. And no prizes for guessing why we had Anirudh on the podcast, right? Just so we could get into kind of peel off all of these layers of history and bring that to the listeners.
There's a few more layers I could tell you about the Vijayanagara temple actually. So I won't take too long with this.
Yeah, please.
So if you look at the moldings on the base of the Vijayanagara temple, you will see a lot of like depictions of horses.
Right.
Now it's fairly common to see horses in South Indian temples. So especially if you look at Hoysala temples, the Hoysala dynasty that I alluded to in the beginning of this podcast, you will see like this entire band just of horses at the bottom of their temples. So what Vijayanagara does is this interesting spin on that. So they're not using soapstone, which is what the Hoysala use. So they use granite instead. So granite is not really as moldable. It's not as soft as soapstone. So you can't really express as many images as you can. The images you do express are usually chosen very carefully with like a very deliberate intention. And interestingly enough, Krishnadeva Raya at the bottom of his Vittala temple, you see that most of his horses also have like a merchant leading them. And invariably these merchants are wearing coats and hats and have beards. That's because they're Portuguese. So how interesting is that, right? I mean, this guy is trading with the Portuguese and he chooses to put Portuguese on a South Indian temple. Now, very often we think of South India as this ancient and so such a cultured place and so conservative and like Carnatic music, and that's all we really think about it. South Indian kings were also bloody modern and they were bloody violent as well. For Krishnadeva Raya to be just think about a European power being represented on Indian temple, it really kind of confounds a lot of the stereotypes we have of the purposes and the symbology of temples. And of course, the very famous kind of stone chariot that Krishnadeva Raya has built, right? Now, interestingly enough, that's not how it would have looked back in the day. Back in the day, there would actually have been a little bit of like a pyramidal kind of superstructure on top of it itself. And even though now like there's two elephants in front of it, right? Those elephants aren't actually part of the original chariot. They were just found lying around somewhere and stuck in front of it. Originally, there would have been, originally there would have been horses there. And I've read one article that argues that the reason why Krishnadeva Raya chose to put this big chariot with horses so clearly in front of his temple was to show that he had defeated the Deccan Sultanates, who were famous for the use of cavalry, harnessed the horses of the sultans and put them in a chariot to basically be subordinate in front of his temple.
Oh, wow.
So there's so many layers of symbolism to the Vittala temple. It's a fascinating artifact.
Right.
Absolutely.
And I think the Vittala temple even has these pillars, the musical pillars also, right?
So, just I think within the temple, right? I think that's what we were told by the guide there, that they were like different, about 50 odd pillars that are kind of shaped and designed in a certain way that they produce different musical
sound,
notes. So that was also kind of very interesting.
So it's crazy when you look at it. It's got like everything. They're trying to tell you stuff through it, and then you can it's got elements from all possible aspects.
Yes, and of course, and on top of it, just keep in mind, so as I said, these are modern people. They're very technologically sophisticated. They're really pushing the boundaries of the technology of their time, just like we do. And in addition to its religious significance, in addition to its political symbolism, in addition to its technological statements, in addition to its artistic statements, in addition to its geopolitical statements, on top of all of this, outside the Vittala temple is this huge market avenue.
Right.
Whose scale, like even today, is like really impressive. And of course, like a little off to the side of the Vittala temple, if you just come out and take a left, you'll see there are other temples there as well. So it wasn't really a standalone temple. It's part of this massive complex of buildings that Krishnadeva Raya built, this enormous marketplace that he laid out. So you can really see in this place how the confluence of all these different kinds of power, all these different kinds of messaging are kind of coming together to create something that's very real and very tangible. And there's this beautiful sentiment that a friend of mine expressed when we were on a visit there. He said, just think of all the stories that must have been kindled out in the marketplaces there. Imagine two eyes darting at each other from across the marketplace falling in love. Just imagine the kind of oaths that were taken, the gambles that were made, the big risky deals that were made in that marketplace, the performances of dance that happened in the temple, and of course the stories of the generals and the kings and the queens whose money went into building it. And to think that all of those stories still whisper to us, tantalizing and unknown from those silent rocks, it's really moving to me.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
absolutely.
And that's why I kind of urge people, not just Hampi, right? Even otherwise, before visiting a place, it's always good to kind of try and dig into a little bit of a history, dig into a little bit of its past, try and scratch that surface a little bit, because then that experience becomes so much more meaningful and so much more richer also, right?
Absolutely.
Because it kind of starts to make sense also, like why certain things are a certain way.
Yeah, and I think even when you like read up about all this and go stand there and look at that structure and all that just plays in your mind, you can visually like see it happening right there. Like, oh my God, like the kings would have come from there. This would have happened. That would have happened. So yeah, it's
And
amazing.
for some of you who might need some help, Anirudh is like doing a wonderful job in kind of describing and painting and drawing, and it's not just 2D, it's like a 3D, 4D kind of representation that Anirudh is giving for us. So thank you so much for that, Anirudh. Now, also quickly touching upon, like we touched upon the couple of important temple complexes here, right? The Virupaksha, the Vithala as well. The two hills of Hampi, right? They're also pretty kind of significant and like hard to miss, right? The Hemakuta Hill, the one which we kind of touched upon earlier, and the Matanga Hill. Would you like to touch upon that as well? Did you get a chance? Because both of them can actually be trekked is not the right the word, but you can basically do a quick hike and get on top of those hills, and it's a beautiful view from there as well.
Yeah, and I think even like a sunset can be enjoyed from one place and sunrise from the other. So it just gives a beautiful view of Hampi altogether.
Yeah, really. I mean, so I've touched briefly upon the Hemakuta Hill. So let me talk a bit about the Matanga Hill. So when I climbed up for the first time, right, like I was just imagining what it's like for like a lonely watchman to be like snaking his way up there in like the early hours of the dawn. And I had no idea, like until I got up to the very top, there's actually a temple on top of the hill. And it kind of makes sense why there would be a temple there, of course, since, as I mentioned, Vijayanagara like slowly had this like legend that it was originally Kishkinda, which appears in the Ramayana. Kind of being that legend kind of forms around the city. So of course the emperors of Vijayanagara go out of their way to kind of create these sites that look and feel like the sites of the Ramayana. So to this day, there is one site that is supposed to be the site where the goddess Sita was kept safe by the Vanaras, and of course the Matanga Hill is also attached to various stories of the Ramayana. For me, the thing that really stood out going on top of the Matanga Hill was when you look down and you see Achyutaraya's temple just below that.
Right.
Now, Achyutaraya was Krishnadevaraya's younger brother and his successor, and if you look at that temple, that at least for me was the first time that the geometry of Indian temples began to sink into me. Because when you look at it from there, you can actually see it's a number of like geometric grids that are positioned on top of each other. And then you see just outside that this huge kind of another kind of massive temple bazaar. So clearly what Achyutaraya is doing here is doing what his brother Krishnadevaraya did with the Vithala temple. So he's creating a temple that's dedicated to a god of his choosing, and he's laying out this massive kind of commercial avenue outside of it. And as you like descend from the Matanga Hill, there's this nice little staircase that takes you down to Achyutaraya's temple. You will see the way that the Vijayanagari people actually went about cutting these hard granite boulders, right? You'll see that they basically put like a whole bunch of little wedges into the rock. They would carve little kind of grooves, put in like a wooden wedge, fill it up with water so the wooden wedge kind of expands, and that creates like this huge perfect cut, like a very clean cut through the rock. and they just like pry the boulders apart, and they really shape them into almost these jigsaw-like pieces and put them all together. And there's very steep but like ancient, like almost like what 500-600-year-old stairways that are still in like really good condition considering their age. And you can walk down them, and you will see little canals, and you will see little riverways, and you will see also little shrines that are hidden away under the hill, which once again like kind of takes you back to the fact that Vijayanagara is an Indian city like many other Indian cities. Just like in modern Indian cities, you will see dargahs and you will see little temples at like crossroads or under banyan trees. Vijayanagara also had those, like they had these little temples in caves, and those temples are still like in some ways active today, and thus giving you a very real sense of the texture of the city, and what it might have been like back in the day.
Yeah, exactly. That's a really important bit of the experience also, right? Obviously, the temples and the royal enclosure are all beautiful, but getting on top of these hills and getting that view of the sunrise as well as the city, it's just magnificent.
Yeah, and it actually, like as you said, you can, like, I mean, the plan is completely laid out very clear there. The temple, and then the beautiful, huge market that used to be there. Yeah. And I think I even noticed there was a huge bath also there. I'm not sure if I got it right, but the temple way even led to a very huge bath, and we could see the way the water pipeline or whatever was laid back then. It was like mesmerizing, considering that, you know, this was made like hundreds of years back, hundreds of years back, that all this planning went into this place. Yeah.
So it's truly remarkable sometimes. Like I've come across references from freaking like 10th, 11th century literature, which talk about like heated pools and like water coming on demand from these kind of bronze animals inside the inside royal enclosures and all that. So one thing I would like to say though is that we should really be too romantic about the past in the way that we think about it. In a lot of ways, yes, these are representations of truly remarkable achievements of our ancestors, but they're also in a lot of ways symbols of inequality. It's not like everybody in Vijayanagara had access to like hydraulic engineers who come and like set up their home with like running water and fancy toilets, or build temples for them like with massive enclosures. It was very often only the elite of Vijayanagara who could really afford to build those monuments. And it's very easy to forget that. Looking at Vijayanagara, it's very easy to only think of the stories of all these great rayas and emperors. But Vijayanagara was really made by the common people, the people who would have actually braved the jungle to get firewood and food for their families, who would have broken their backs in the rice fields and like paid massive extortionate taxes to the Vijayanagari elite without ever having a chance of like riding on a horse or getting some perfume or jewelry or all the things that we usually associate, the glamorous things that we think about in history. It's very easy to think of history as being only about the good stuff. I'm sure that somebody in 2300 is only going to think about the Ambanis and say, oh wow, people really knew how to live it back in 2020, man. But
I was actually going to make that reference right now, that it's probably the Ambanis and Adanis of those days, but a wonderful view of the past, right? It gives, all of this gives a wonderful view of the past, but kind of beautifully intermingled and intertwined with this is also this little part of Hampi we call as the hippie town, right? Right across the river, and a completely different vibe of its own. Would you want to touch upon that as well, Anirudh?
So I can't comment on that in too much detail because I'm sure my parents will listen to this podcast. Hi mom, hi dad. But like very briefly, it has a totally different vibe. I stayed at this place called, I think that's called the Laughing Buddha, one of those old really famous joints over there. And you can sit there early in the dawn, watching watching the river flowing past the Virupaksha temple, and watching like that temple elephant being bathed, and there's a little bit of mist and there's sunshine coming through the trees, and it really once again feels like a callback to the past, right? I mean, there's a lot of stuff that happens in the hippie town that like I'm not really the biggest fan of. I mean, there's very different treatment that's meted out to like people like European travelers versus Indian travelers, and I've heard some pretty sad stories about how farmers who lived around Hampi, like basically because of rising prices, land prices were basically like lost a lot of their property and were forced to like move elsewhere. So again, like it's important to remember that that kind of inequality was there back then and is still there even now.
Yep. Yeah, different times, but it kind of manifests in one way or the other, right? You kind of are able to draw parallels in some way. And you kind of touched upon the river as well, right? The river Tungabhadra. That's also like a lifeline, right? Like usually the great cities come up on the banks of rivers, and Tungabhadra in this case, it also has like a very significant place and role in the history of the empire, and as well as the history of Hampi, right? And taking a coracle ride. I think coracle is what you call it, right? The little boats you have, taking those across. That's a great experience in itself also. Perhaps one can try that out too while crossing over, right?
Yeah, definitely. My friends tell me it's amazing. I'm sorry, I haven't actually been on a coracle in the 3 times I've been to Hampi, so I can't say anything more about that. But since you briefly touched upon the topic of rivers, Saif, I mean, I think you've actually touched upon something that was very important to the history of Vijayanagara as well. A lot of its great conflicts with the Deccan Sultanates were fought over this geopolitical region called the Raichur Doab, which is the region between the Krishna and the Tungabhadra rivers. As you can imagine, because it's between 2 rivers, there's a lot of alluvial soil, it's very fertile. And for like a Deccan empire surviving on this very hard, rocky, red soils of the Deccan, control of this alluvial area is like very, very important to it. So that's one of the big reasons why Vijayanagara is actually built so far north. Rather than being deep within its territory, this is the capital city of the empire. It's basically on the frontier of the empire itself. The whole objective of building it there being to exert as much effective control over the Raichur Doab as humanly possible. And of course, that worked out well for Vijayanagara for about a century or so, until, of course, the disastrous Battle of Talikota, where its advantageous position suddenly became the biggest disadvantage it could possibly have had, and eventually led to its rapid and catastrophic fall.
Yeah, some of these things I would say are mind-blowing, especially when you start connecting the dots, right? I actually take a lot of effort to do research about an episode before I get into it. But yeah, I have been stumped on this one, is all I can say, Anirudh, on multiple occasions. So I'm glad in one way, though, that we're able to have these so deep conversations, right, about this important place that is Hampi. I'd rather be stumped than miss out on these conversations. So really glad that we're having this. And the point again is that even though we've kind of gone so much into depth, right, over the past half hour or so about Hampi, we're still scratching the surface. There's so many more like clusters of temples and temple complexes beyond the ones that we've even touched, right? Right from an underground Shiva temple that's there to even
King's Balance.
Things like the King's Balance, to the Bhima Gate, to there's a Ganesha temple.
A monolithic temple.
The monolithic Nandi. So there's so much more, right? I mean, we could probably touch upon each one of those and it'll take us over 2 hours. But the point comes that it was such a
mesmerizing place.
Mesmerizing, rich, historic place. And no wonder Faiza had dreams about visiting Hampi right back when she was in her 7th, like we were discussing, right? Faiza, you want to tell more it was?
Yeah, thank you, Selvi. So I remember when I was in 7th standard, we had this chapter in my Kannada textbook about Hampi, and it was so beautiful. I just you just transformed you from your textbook to the Hampi city. It just spoke about the beautiful temples and how the place looked and everything. And since then, I wanted to visit Hampi. So this is like 7th standard. So I pestered my parents and they said that, okay, maybe someday. And then after that, they were like, oh, you can't travel alone. And then finally, after I got married, one of the places that we visited, like, initially when we got married, was Hampi, and I was so glad that we got to be there. Like, this is one of the places where Saif and I just think back and say that we want to go back to Hampi someday again and spend more time.
And so, even more now, especially after listening to so many of the references and connections that Anirudh has called out, it kind of ignites that fire even more now.
So I think Hampi is one of those places where if you are a history lover, or if you just enjoy and watching all these beautiful buildings, you have to go to Hampi. It's mesmerizing.
Absolutely. And what better than have some background reading or background listening about Hampi from Anirudh, right? So brilliant. Thank you so much for calling out these beautiful things, Anirudh. Now, as we start to inch closer towards closing off the episode, right? Are there more important pieces or bits to this? I know there's definitely a lot more, but any important ones that you'd like to call out, Anirudh?
I would think the single biggest thing, guys, and again, thank you so much for your kind words and for having me. It's like been like a real pleasure, especially to have like people who are interested in history and travel to talk to about this. But the one thing I'd like to touch upon before we wrap up is, of course, the Royal Centre of Hampi, where you can still see the remains of the great palaces and the monumental architecture that these guys built, right? So when you get to the Royal Centre, you see stuff like the Mahanami Dibba, which is this enormous ceremonial platform. Once again, on the base of the Mahanami Dibba, you will see sculptures depicting horses coming from various parts of the world. And it's clearly built in such a way that the king basically climbs onto the top of the platform. On various ceremonial occasions, there would have been, even though now like the top is basically bare, there would probably have been like a wooden kind of roof and lintel for various ceremonial occasions where sacrifices and ceremonies were conducted. You can imagine the king standing there and like raising his arms to the roar of crowds almost. It's really eerie. And also in the broader kind of like palace complex itself, you will see this massive temple tank that's put there. And like it's mostly known now, of course, for Instagram purposes, but there's actually a very deep kind of political reason why that temple tank is there. Now, that if you recall at the beginning of this conversation, I talked about the Chalukyas, this empire that once ruled the Deccan. Now, the Chalukya imperial symbol was a boar. If you go through Vijayanagara, everywhere you will see this little carving of like a boar with a sun and the moon, basically indicating how Vijayanagara was trying to kind of reappropriate this old legend of the Chalukyas and say, look, the boar, the imperial boar will last as long as the sun and the moon. And this particular tank that is there in the royal enclosure was actually put there by the last major emperor of Vijayanagara, Aliya Ramaraya, who was Krishnadevaraya's son-in-law. And he actually attacked the northern Deccan, found an old Chalukya temple tank and had it carted entirely, piece by piece, to his palace enclosure and rebuilt it there.
Oh my God, okay.
Deliberately to make a claim of connection to the Chalukyas. And of course, to think of the amazing stuff that went down in the palace complex itself, like really boggles the mind. You can to this day see various channels that were built there for waterworks. You can see the remains of the huge kind of court complex where poets of Telugu and a great variety of South Indian languages would have been brought. And just a little short walk away, you would have seen the Hazara Rama temple, which has these great kind of granite pieces that are perfectly cut and fit together into its wall. It's truly something to see. And on top of it, of course, is the entire narrative of the Ramayana. But also you will see depictions of parades such as the Mahanami festival from Vijayanagara. You will see like profusions of like dancing women and like horses like beautifully caparisoned, warriors parading, and really gives you a sense of the noise and heat and then the color of like actually being in Vijayanagara in its heyday. But one interesting thing I'd like to point out about the Hazara Rama temple is actually within the temple itself, you will see that while most of the temple is made of granite, like the walls, there are some temples there are some pillars outside the temple in the porch that are made of black stone. And that is because they were actually captured by Krishnadevaraya from Orissa, which was where his greatest rival, the Gajapati king, lived. And he actually took them from a Gajapati temple and brought them to his temple to put them again in front of the porch in a kind of subordinate position to kind of symbolize his superiority over the Orissa kingdom, just as his Vittala temple kind of symbolizes his superiority over the Deccan Sultanates. And to think that at the very apogee of Vijayanagara, when it seemed that its power could not have been challenged, when its kings had like brought these architectural elements from all over the Deccan, from Orissa, and like put them in its city as these violent but powerful reminders of exactly who they were and where they came from. It was at that exact brilliant moment in its history that it just vanished from public memory and passed into legend. And I think that one thing that really drives human memory is the ability to really tell a good story. And there is no story in Indian history, at least in modern Indian history, that is as well known, as spectacular, and ultimately as catastrophic, as sudden, and as tragic as the story of Vijayanagara.
I think it has all the ingredients you need to make that, what do you call these big set movies that Sanjay Leela Bhansali makes, right?
Please don't give it to him, man. No, not Sanjay Leela Bhansali. I don't want to see Vijayanagara made into Padmavat. So.
But yeah, thank you so much, Anirudh, for kind of beautifully calling this out. I've been like mentioning this again and again, but it just kind of goes to show how much even I've been kind of literally blown away by these accounts. And obviously, like when I had seen it the first time, done my reading the first time, I was blown away. But now just to go over these again and connecting these dots again, it's completely different experience, and getting blown over again and again in that process.
Yeah, and as I was saying, I mean, Saif and I wanted to visit Hampi again, but I think after listening to you, we really, really have to plan one after the entire COVID situation is settled. So,
absolutely, and thank you again for calling out this beautiful, beautiful city. And like I was saying even before the recording, right, it was an important episode, and we wanted to get it right. And
because this is a special place, and Hampi is such a beautiful place, and I feel like you've like done way beyond justice to the episode. So thank you so much.
Thank you guys so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure, and as I said, it's always a great joy to talk about Hampi to people who like really appreciate it, and I'm glad I was able to do justice to it. I think that in a way, there's all of us like doing homage to the collective heritage that we're all inheritors of.
Yeah,
absolutely. And Anirudh, before we wrap it up, why don't you also give a little bit of a sneak peek about your podcast that you host to our listeners and how they can check it out?
Okay, thank you, Saif. So I host two podcasts. The first is Echoes of India. Echoes of India is roughly 600-year odyssey through Indian history from the conquest of Alexander the Great up to the fall of the Gupta Empire and its immediate aftermath. Echoes will probably pick up later in this year as my book on the early medieval Deccan gets closer to publication. My second podcast is Yuddha, the Indian military history podcast. Now, what I aim to do in Yuddha is basically provide a critical understanding of what India's military history actually is like. It might be a surprise to many that the land of Gandhi is also the land that has some of the world's most extraordinary military innovations. And so if you like this conversation and if you like the Musafir Stories, please check it out. And thank you so much for having me here, Saif and Faiza. Thank you for your warm words, especially it's really quite moving. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. It's our pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, it's our pleasure, and those words come from the bottom of our hearts. Thank you so much. It was a real pleasure. I would say it was a high point in the podcast as well, having you on the show.
Yeah, I was telling Saif, let's keep this episode for our 100th episode. But Saif is like, I can't wait for so long.
It's okay. Yeah. Whenever it is, it's going to be a special episode, and we really thank you for that, Anirudh. Thank you. That was yet another great episode of the Musafir Stories. If you guys like the show, please subscribe to us on iTunes or Apple Podcasts, Savan, Pocket Casts, Castbox, Stitcher, or any other podcasting app available on iOS or Android. Please do leave us a review on iTunes. It goes a long way in the show's discoverability. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. We go by the handle The Musafir Stories. Or, if it suits you, you could email us at themusafirstories@gmail.com or visit our website at www.themusafirstories.com for more information. All of these links will be made available in the show notes section of each episode. So here's to more traveling, sharing, and inspiring. Stay tuned for our next episode. Until then, happy travels and goodbye.